Well, here we have a saw on the workbench, and I swear it's a case of deja vu. It seems like I've been working on one like this before. And I guess I kind of did, because before I worked on a Homelite XL 12, and this is an XL Super. It's an XL hay fever. It's an XL Super. So I guess I have to do my research to actually see what the difference is between these two. I mean, they look pretty darn close, so I'm assuming it's just a different model year, and they came up with a new name to, make something old seem new. But irregardless, it looks like a good old solid saw. I think it's got a 20-inch bar on it, so we'll definitely be able to put this thing to use. So after doing a little bit of research on the old interwebs, we found out there are a couple of differences between the XL12 and the Super XL. Apparently there's a huge displacement increase of 3.8 cc's. Whew! Talk about moving some chips there with that increase. Not much, but I guess it's something. And there was a different reed cage on it. Maybe some improvements on different style bearings on the drive side of the crank. But other than that, they were pretty much identical. A lot of the parts all swap around. Now I bought this saw for $10, and there was another one sitting right next to it. The problem with it is it was a little bit rougher, and when you rolled it over, you could definitely feel that it didn't have the compression that this one did. So I figured I'd end up, I'd buy it if it was cheap enough, but I wasn't going to spend $10 on both of them. Well, sure enough, somebody else ended up bidding the other one up to $5, and I didn't want to pay $7.50 for the other one, so that's why we only got one for now. I mean, in the entire 8 seconds that I had looked at the saw over before I bid on it, I thought it looked pretty complete, and I didn't think I'd need any parts for it, so oh well. One of those things, I guess. Yeah, probably should have spent a couple more bucks and just bought it, but I'm saving space, being responsible. See, I don't have a problem. I can quit buying stuff anytime I want. We'll give it the old 5-second restoration. So as you can tell by the number, this was an auction find. I had to shell out an entire $10 for this thing. So Alexander Hamilton would be proud, but this is what we got. Now the cool thing is, this actually has a 20-inch bar on it, which it kind of makes it a little bit top heavy, but this thing's thoroughly grungy. I don't know if I want to put the time into actually cleaning it off. I mean, we're just going to try and get it running. There's some gas in here. What used to be gas. So we're going to have to dump that out. Now my XL12 that I have, that's become the dedicated truck chainsaw. I throw it in the bed of the truck whenever I'm going somewhere, and I don't worry too much about somebody stealing it. Now, maybe I'm jinxing myself, knock on wood, but usually these older saws like this don't gain a whole lot of attention. If you had some brand new Steel or Husky sitting in the bed of that truck, yeah, it might grow legs and walk away. So being the travel saw and the backup saw, I kind of like that XL12. It's done pretty well. I've cut up a fair bit of firewood, and it's gotten a bit of use, so what the heck, why not add one more to the fleet? I mean, it also helps that these are completely before emissions ever came into effect, so yeah, burn that oil. Now, according to this marketing here, it's supposed to be automatic. Well, this thing doesn't have a transmission, so they can't be talking about that. I'm hoping that it has automatic oiling on it. Hitting that plunger all the time to keep the chain lubed, that's not a whole lot of fun, and my attention span isn't that long, so I don't remember to always do that. Now, for some reason, it still has the auxiliary plunger for the oil, so I'm not sure what that's all about. Maybe just give it an extra boost down the straights. I do appreciate the fact that it's got the autopilot mode, so you can just set the throttle, set it and forget it, and cut your leg off at the same time. One of my pet peeves about old chainsaws is I love the lack of a muffler, and unfortunately this does have a sound deadening device on it, so you know, I guess you can't wake up the neighbors too early with this thing. This saw is just about perfect for my style. It's definitely seen some stuff. It's kind of beat up, it's worn in, but it still seems pretty solid mechanically. You know, I gave it the thorough compression test when I pulled it over, you know, before I bought it, and the thing feels like it has a ton of compression, so I'm hoping that the internals are solid. So we might as well take a look inside, you know, see what we got. Well, there's an air filter, no surprise there. And there's the carburetor. It's a Zama, made in Japan. That's at least half quality. It's kind of interesting how in the old saw design they used to have this like cavity, you know, where the carburetor sat, and it was filtration all above it, you know, for where the air got pulled into the carb. On newer saws, it's a lot more direct, like your car. You know, they got a filter bolted directly to the carb, and it just goes straight through. I mean, look at all the extra trouble you had to go through sealing the throttle cables and all the choke cables and, well, rods and stuff like that. It just seems like a whole lot of extra work going through the effort of having this extra chamber right here. I mean, if I had to put money on something, I say that the diaphragm is bad in there, but I mean, you never know. Miracles happen every day. Speaking of miracles, the other day I was working on a Jeep that was 22 years old, okay? And I had to take the hub bearings out of the front, you know, those unit bearings. They actually came out of the knuckle and everything without excessive force. I mean, I gotta tell you, sometimes there's the higher force at work because you can't make that kind of stuff up. So since this saw is probably slated for a life of work, we're actually gonna pull the carburetor apart right off the bat because that's what you do. I mean, you don't roll the dice here. We're not gambling. We can't afford to lose that much money. So we're just gonna see what we got to start off with and go from there. So that fuel line has definitely seen better days, and it's actually supposed to be, you know, sized appropriately to seal off the gas tank right there. So as you can see, it's not doing a whole lot, and it's pretty cracked. The fuel these days doesn't help either. If anybody's ever used any of the ethanol fuel in this older equipment, that usually seems like the death knell for, you know, all the old fuel lines and the, you know, diaphragms and gaskets and all that. It's like, you know, it survived for 30 years, but as soon as you end up putting some, you know, crappy gas into it here, you know, a couple years ago, it's shot. I guess I have a little bit more respect for Zama now. I always thought that was a cheap aftermarket supplier, you know, maybe just came around in the last so many years, but heck, they were supplying carbs back then, so as I'm putting this air filter back on, you know, you always think about older stuff being overbuilt and heavy duty and all that. Well, there's a lot of times where the older stuff is kind of, you know, not necessarily overbuilt and heavy duty. I wouldn't say it's flimsy, but basically standard duty, you know. You can feel when you're tightening down this cap, you know, there's a certain resistance where this nut stops. And you got to realize that's where you need to stop, you know. It's like the manufacturers had a little bit of confidence in your own, you know, capabilities here to realize that, you know, when this thing gets tight, you stop. And that's as tight as you need to put this thing here. You know, you got to have some responsibility when you're using a machine like this. You can't always depend on the manufacturer to make everything foolproof, idiot-proof, you know. This assumed that you had some intelligence and that you had to stop and use your own judgment. And that really seems to be missing from so much stuff these days. I mean, back then, if you overcranked this thing so tight that you broke the cap, well, tough luck. We'll sell you another one. So we pulled the fuel line out of the fuel tank there, and it really wasn't making a good fit. I thought it had shrank down or something, but as it turns out, the hose that they had in there wasn't quite the right size. It needed like a grommet like this or something down at the fuel tank side. Maybe this was at the fuel tank, and there was a piece of longer hose here that went from the fuel tank up through here to the carb. Maybe that broke and they just yanked this out of the tank and stuck it on the carb to get it running. So this looks like a specialty piece, and of course I don't have one just laying around, so we're going to try and make do without it. Now, of course, your standard off-the-shelf piece of hose isn't exactly going to work. We need to make that little step-up sealing grommet ourselves out of a combination of hoses or whatever to make a spacer. So regular 1/8 inch fuel line looks like it should probably work pretty well on the carburetor side and down at the fuel filter, but we need to like step this up here to make a seal. And while digging around in the miscellaneous hose, found some plastic fuel injection line. Now this is hard line, but it's very thin walled, and I think we can slide this over top of the 1/8 inch fuel line and use this as the spacer. So the 1/8 inch fuel line fits pretty snugly within here, and we're going to probably, get a pre-cut length, insert it down into the tank, slide this down the fuel line, and then jam it into that the hole on there. Now the hole that goes through into the air filter housing, that's slightly bigger than the one going into the fuel tank. So we've got the spacer there for the fuel tank, and I used a piece of 1/4 inch fuel line, slid it on there for the grommet to the air filter housing. Looks factory to me. So we got that spacer worked into there. Now we're just going to put this spacer, slide it down there, and seat it on the housing. So there you go. I'm sure you could actually order this part. It's probably like $8, and yeah, have it delivered and fix it. But sometimes getting creative like this when you don't necessarily need to save you some time, and it'll also maybe save you whenever you can't find that part or you're stranded on the side of the road. You got to come up with a interesting repair to get you by. So we just threw some bar oil in there, and it's working the pump. Now, proper way would be go through the carb, double check everything, make sure it's clean, check the diaphragms. We never learn our lesson, so we're going to throw some gas in it and see what happens right off the bat. So we're not even using fresh fuel in this. I mean, it's sort of fresh. It's non-ethanol mix. But, secondhand fuel out of one of the boat gas tanks. Alright, didn't even check for spark, but that's what the pull cord's for. A little bit lean on the bottom. to make a couple adjustments. Definitely lean on the bottom end. Either gonna have to adjust that or maybe just let the carburetor diaphragm kind of soften up here. We'll fire it up again later and try it. See how that does it. Chain probably needs sharpened. Well, that was almost too easy. Thing runs pretty decent. Use a little bit more tuning here and there. Sharpen that chain up, and this will be a good spare saw to have around, especially with the 20-inch bar on it.